Okay, so you want to own a demolition company. You've got the fantasy already loaded up. The countdown, the plunger, some guy in a hard hat pressing a big red button while a crowd behind a fence goes, ooh, as a 14-story building folds into itself like a lawn chair. Easy money, right? Blow stuff up, collect a check, do it again next Tuesday. It's basically getting paid to be a 10-year-old with a firecracker, except the firecracker is a building and the allowance is 7 figures. It is not that simple. In fact, it's almost the exact opposite of simple, and the real story is one of the quietest, meanest business models in all of construction. An industry that makes most of its actual money from things that have nothing to do with the explosion, and can be wiped out entirely by a single afternoon going wrong. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a demolition company really makes its profit, why the 5 seconds of collapse everyone pays to watch are basically worthless, and why demolition company is just a polite corporate label for professional liability absorber that happens to own a wrecking ball. Let's kill the fantasy first. A demolition company does not sell destruction. Nobody hands over $2 million just to watch a building fall down for fun. If that's all you wanted, you could set it on fire yourself and save the invoice. What a demolition company actually sells is the removal of a problem that everyone else is too scared, too unlicensed, or too uninsured to touch. A collapsing building isn't an event. It's a liability with a foundation. And the entire industry exists to make that liability someone else's legal and financial responsibility. For a fee. Here's the part that breaks people's brains a little. The explosion, the part everyone associates with demolition, is often less than 1% of the actual work. Before a single stick of dynamite goes in, crews spend weeks, sometimes months, stripping the building down to its bare steel skeleton by hand, disconnecting utilities, mapping structural load points, and getting sign-off from more government agencies than most people know exist. The implosion itself takes about 10 seconds. The permits alone can take 10 months. So let's talk about what it actually costs to get into this business, because the range here is genuinely absurd. At the small end, you've got the guy with one used mini excavator, a dump trailer, and a pickup truck, tearing down single-family houses in suburban tear-down markets. Total rig cost, somewhere around $150,000, financed. Jobs run $15,000 to $40,000 each, and if he's efficient, he can knock out one a week. That's a real business. It's also basically a landscaping company with a bigger machine. Step up to the mid-tier and you're looking at regional commercial demolition. Strip malls, old big box stores, dead office parks. This is where you need a high-reach excavator with hydraulic shears bolted on, machines that run $800,000 to $1.2 million apiece. And you generally need at least 4 or 5 of them sitting in a yard because jobs overlap. A company this size might land a contract to flatten a defunct Sears store for somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million, depending on square footage and what's buried underneath. Then there's the top tier, the implosion specialists, the Controlled Demolition Incorporated tier, the company founded by the Loiseau family that's been imploding stadiums and skyscrapers since the 1960s. These are the outfits that took down the Kingdom in Seattle in the year 2000 for a contract worth roughly $9 million, or leveled Texas Stadium in 2010. This is a tiny elite club. Getting into it requires decades of engineering trust, insurance nobody else can even qualify for, and a client list that includes government agencies who will end your company's existence the day you get it wrong. And even inside those 3 tiers, the math is weirder than it looks. The small-scale guy with the mini excavator actually runs one of the best margin percentages in the whole industry because his overhead is basically a truck payment and gas money. The mid-tier regional company usually has the worst margins of anyone, stuck bidding against 5 other firms with nearly identical equipment for the exact same strip mall. And the top-tier implosion specialists barely compete on price at all, because there are maybe a handful of companies on the entire planet insured and trusted enough to legally detonate a stadium in the middle of a city. That's not really a demolition business anymore at that point. That's closer to a licensed monopoly that happens to use dynamite. And speaking of getting it wrong, here's where nobody warns you about the traps. Trap number 1, hazardous material abatement. And this one alone can eat a project whole. Before you demolish anything built before roughly 1980, you almost certainly need asbestos and lead abatement, and that abatement bill can legally cost more than the demolition itself. We're talking anywhere from $100,000 to over $500,000 on a single mid-sized commercial building, depending on how contaminated it is. Trap number 2. What's underground? You can survey a lot all you want, but old cities are full of buildings sitting on top of other buildings' forgotten foundations, century-old utility lines nobody mapped, and soil contamination from whatever used to be there in 1950. Every unmapped surprise is a change order, and change orders are where profit margins go to die. Trap number 3. Insurance that would make your eyes water. Demolition requires general liability insurance and something called environmental impairment liability insurance, because you're not just breaking a building, you're potentially releasing whatever toxic material is trapped inside it into the surrounding neighborhood. Annual premiums for a mid-size firm regularly run into the 6 figures before a single claim is ever filed. Trap number 4. Your neighbors will sue you. Vibration damage, dust complaints, cracked foundations. 2 properties over. Demolition generates an entire subgenre of civil lawsuits, and settling even the small ones eats straight into margin. Trap number 5. And this is the one that quietly bankrupts companies that are otherwise well-run. The calendar. Federal environmental rules require a mandatory advance notification window before hazardous demolition work can even begin, and local permitting offices can drag that window out for months longer than anyone budgeted for. Every one of those idle weeks still comes with a truck payment, an insurance bill, and a crew that expects to get paid whether or not they're allowed on site yet. Here's the trap almost nobody sees coming until it's already happened to them. A company doesn't go under because it lost a bid. It goes under because it won 5 bids, and all 5 got stuck in permitting at the exact same time. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the revenue side of this business is layered in ways that would surprise almost nobody who's actually in it, and almost everybody who isn't. Layer 1 is the obvious one, the demolition contract fee itself. This is what gets negotiated, what gets bid on, what shows up in the headline number. But here's the trap almost nobody sees coming. A lot of demolition companies deliberately underbid the actual demolition fee. Sometimes they'll bid a job at break-even, or even take a small loss on paper. Why would anyone do that on purpose? Layer 2 is the real answer, and it's scrap metal. Every building has copper wiring running through its walls, steel rebar reinforcing its concrete, and aluminum in its ductwork. And every ounce of it is salvageable and sellable. A single mid-sized commercial demolition can yield hundreds of tons of scrap steel and thousands of pounds of copper wire, and copper alone, depending on the market, can be worth several dollars a pound. Companies model their bids around the metal they expect to pull out, and when copper prices spike, a demolition contract that looked mediocre on paper can suddenly become the most profitable job of the year. When copper crashes, like it did in 2015 and again in 2020, that same contract can flip from profitable to a loss overnight, on a job that was already finished and paid for. Read that again. The building is already down, the invoice is already sent, and the profit or the loss is still being decided by a commodities market 3,000 miles away. This is also why you'll sometimes see a demolition company bid unusually aggressively on a building that looks completely unremarkable from the street. Nobody watching from outside knows what that building is actually made of. A 1960s office tower with old copper plumbing and heavy structural steel can be worth dramatically more in scrap than a newer building twice its size built with cheaper modern materials. The crew tearing it down isn't looking at a building. They're looking at a metal deposit wearing a facade. Layer 3 is architectural salvage. Reclaimed brick, old-growth timber beams, vintage fixtures, ornate ironwork, sold off to specialty salvage dealers and renovation markets. It's a smaller slice, but on older ornate buildings it can be genuinely lucrative, because a beam that's 150 years old is worth more as furniture wood than it ever was as a beam. Layer 4 is the counterintuitive one. The one that flips how most people think size works in this business. Position beats size. A tiny single-lot teardown in dense downtown Manhattan can be more profitable than flattening an entire 200,000 square foot rural warehouse. Why? Because urban demolition has almost no competition. Few companies are licensed, bonded, and insured to work safely in a tight footprint next to occupied buildings. So pricing power is enormous. Meanwhile, a huge rural warehouse job attracts a dozen competitive bids, gets squeezed down to razor-thin margins, and the extra scale barely matters once you subtract the extra fuel, extra labor hours, and extra dump runs. Bigger isn't better here. Scarcer is better. And now let's talk about the costs that quietly eat all of that layered revenue, because this is the part that turns a good year into a bad one almost overnight. The killer here is fixed cost. Equipment financing doesn't pause because a permit got delayed. Insurance premiums don't shrink because your revenue did. A high-reach excavator sitting idle for 6 weeks while the city processes an asbestos variance is still costing you a monthly loan payment, still costing you yard rental, still costing you a certified operator's salary whether he swings a shear that week or not. Demolition is also statistically one of the most dangerous trades in construction, which means workers' compensation insurance is another brutal fixed-line item, and it only moves in one direction after an incident: up. Stack those fixed costs up, and you start to see the shape of the whole business. A single high-reach excavator with shears can run a company somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000 a month just in financing before it has moved a single brick. Multiply that across a fleet of 5 or 6 machines, add certified operators who legally need specialized training to run demolition-grade equipment safely, add the 6-figure insurance premium, add bonding fees to even qualify for public contracts, and a mid-size firm can easily be carrying $80,000 to $100,000 a month in costs that exist whether or not a single job is currently active. Revenue is lumpy. Fixed costs are not. That mismatch is the quiet engine that has killed far more demolition companies than any single collapsed wall ever did. This is the setup for the actual trap, the structural flaw that has ended more than one demolition company's existence. And it isn't a bad bid. And it isn't a slow year. It's liability. One incident, one death, one fraud investigation, and the entire business can be gone within days, regardless of how many profitable jobs came before it. Here's the case study, and it's about as real and as brutal as this industry gets. In 2001, the Deutsche Bank building at 130 Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan was catastrophically damaged when the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed into it. The building stood there, contaminated with asbestos and debris, wrapped in black netting, for 6 years before deconstruction finally began in February 2007. The demolition subcontract went to a company called the John Galt Corporation, awarded for roughly $60 million. Even though, at the time, Galt was already under investigation over its business ties. The red flags started stacking up fast. In May 2007, a 15-foot pipe fell 35 stories and crashed into the roof of the adjacent firehouse. Workers were using acetylene torches inside a structure packed with contaminated debris. And most critically, the building's standpipe, the system legally required to deliver water to firefighters on every floor in an emergency, had been disconnected. On August 18, 2007, a fire broke out inside the half-demolished tower. It grew to 7 alarms. 100 firefighters responded, and when they tried to use the standpipe, there was no water. It erupted uselessly in the basement instead. 2 New York City firefighters, Robert Bedia and Joseph Graffagnino, were trapped inside and died. 100 more firefighters were injured. Let that land for a moment. This didn't happen because a wall came down on the wrong side of the street. It happened because a piece of required safety infrastructure had been quietly disconnected and nobody stopped work to fix it. Bovis Lend Lease, the general contractor, terminated Galt's contract 3 days later. A criminal investigation followed. In 2008, the Manhattan District Attorney indicted the John Galt Corporation along with 3 of its supervisors on charges including manslaughter and reckless endangerment. Separately, investigators discovered that Galt's own purchasing agent had been stealing from the project the entire time, padding invoices for basic supplies like gloves and plastic sheeting to the tune of more than $1 million in stolen public money. The company that was supposed to be safely dismantling a contaminated skyscraper was simultaneously being robbed from the inside. The project that was supposed to take a couple of years dragged on until January 2011, more than 3 years after the fire, nearly a decade after 9/11. Bovis agreed to finance a $10 million memorial fund for the firefighters' families, and after years of trials, the individual supervisors were acquitted of manslaughter. The John Galt Corporation itself was ultimately found guilty only of a misdemeanor, reckless endangerment, carrying a fine of $10,000. $10,000 on a $60 million contract that ended with 2 firefighters dead, a criminal fraud case, a stopped project, and a company's name permanently attached to one of the deadliest construction disasters in New York City history. The fine was nothing. The reputational and legal collapse was everything. That's the trap. It's never really about the size of the penalty, it's about whether your name can survive being in the sentence at all. So let's talk about what a normal year actually looks like on the ledger, because most demolition companies never come near a disaster like that. They just live in the gap between a very good year and a genuinely bad one. In a good year, picture a mid-sized regional firm running roughly 15 commercial contracts averaging $400,000 each. That's $6 million in demolition revenue. Scrap steel and copper prices are strong that year, adding another $700,000 on top. Costs stay predictable. No surprise contamination, no accidents, insurance renews at the same rate. Net margin lands around 12%. That's roughly $800,000 in profit. On paper, a genuinely healthy year. Now the bad year, same company, same 15 contracts, same $6 million in demolition revenue. Except this time, one job hits unmapped asbestos mid-tear down, blowing $250,000 past budget. A minor injury on another site triggers an OSHA review and a stop work order that costs 3 weeks of idle equipment payments. Because of that incident, the annual insurance premium jumps from $180,000 to $360,000. And that year, of all years, copper prices crash 40%. Gutting the scrap revenue that was supposed to pad the margin. Same top-line revenue. Margin collapses to 2%. Profit, about $120,000, and that's before a single neighbor files a vibration damage lawsuit. One mid-sized settlement, say $60,000 or $70,000, which is nothing by construction litigation standards, and that profitable year turns into a net loss, on paper, with the exact same contracts, the exact same buildings, and the exact same crew that made $800,000 12 months earlier. Nothing about the company's skill changed. Nothing about its client list changed. The only thing that moved was risk, and risk was never on the balance sheet to begin with. So, is owning a demolition company a good business? It depends entirely on how well you manage the risks nobody can see, not on how well you manage the rubble everyone can. The buildings are the easy part. Anyone with a big enough machine can knock down a wall. What separates the companies still standing in 20 years from the ones that vanish after a single bad afternoon is invisible. The abatement done properly instead of skipped, the standpipe left connected instead of disconnected, the insurance actually adequate instead of just cheap. Because in the end, a demolition company was never really in the business of tearing buildings down. It's in the business of betting that nothing buried inside them tears the company down first.